Okay. So I'm just going to ask people to mute. I muted everyone. If you would like to ask a question, by all means, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask yourself a question, just as people who are here locally, who are here in person. You can also stop and ask a question. But there is quite a bit of material to go through because the story is fascinating and it's a very, very difficult story to sort of try to trim in order to make it a coherent and easy to deliver package. In fact, I even asked Chat GPT to assist me in trying to make this less verbose. It did not work. I spent about a week and a half. I have about a 20,000 word document where I sort of collected all the information that I could. I put it all into a single source and I sort of streamlined it to make it all consecutive, to make it a cohesive story. But then I asked, hey, ChatGPT, can you please help me trim this down and make it less verbose, take out the padding, take out my own literary flourish, take out, some when I copy and pasted from some articles or from some interviews. ChatGPT did not help me at all. It just absolutely floundered. So I guess you can hand off some tasks to AI, but certain things you just really couldn't do. It just could not figure out how to do this, and I spent about a week and a half, and I could have done it myself for a shorter period of time, but I sit there had to sort of walk ChatGPT through it. But it still kind of floundered. It still kind of failed. So we're going to now just switch. We're going to now start talk about the Munkatch Hasidim. So as you can see, this is part of a series. This is from Dynasty to Discord, and this specific class is entitled Munkatch, the Rebbe's Office Jumps a Generation. And this is a remarkable tale. Hi, Marina. It talks about what happens when the only successor of a prominent Rebbe abdicates his position. It's a narrative that is very, very strongly affected by the currents of history. The Holocaust, Zionism, the establishment of the State of Israel, the relocation of European Jews to North America and to the new State of Israel, as well as elsewhere in the diaspora. And it's also an account of a father born into Hasidim who, after inheriting his crown, decided he just didn't want it any longer, and who could not make peace with his son, who then adopted and picked up the office of being the Rebbe of a group of Hasidim. It's also a narrative that sort of highlights the complicated relationships between fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, in-laws, as it affected the Munkatcher Hasidim. So let's begin. The story begins right over here. As you can see on Google Maps, this is a map of the Ukraine. And this is the city of, let me see if I can remember how it's pronounced in Ukrainian. It's Munkacho or something along those lines. Russian speakers, you can correct me, please. Munkachev. I don't know. I don't think the Ukrainians call it that though, but it might have been what it was called at the time. But anywho, you can come. You can join us. You don't have to stand outside.
Mukachevo.
Um, well, what Mel? How do you pronounce it?
Mukachevo.
Munkachevo. Okay, Munkachevo. It's referred to by the Jews as Munkatch. And if you're Mel, how would you say the city of Munkatch? You have to pardon me. I'm a Litvak. How would you say Munkatch?
My mother would have pronounced it Minkach.
Right, exactly. It's pronounced Munkatch by the Munkatcher Hasidim, but that's not how I float. That's not how I roll. So I'm just going to say Munkatch. You'll have to pardon my pronunciation. I'm not going to be ethnically authentic. But anyway, so this is a town. It's in the Subcarpathian Rus. It is in an area that, at least at the time of the story that we're going to be talking about, was actually controlled by Czechoslovakia. And by 1938, it was absorbed into Hungary. And in 1941, the city had about 13,500 Jewish residents. And that was about 45% of the inhabitants of the city. The total population was almost half Jewish. So let's talk about who the Munkatcher Hasidim were. So the Munkatcher Hasidim sort of traces itself to the very first Rebbe, who was known as the Bnei Yissaschar. This is Tzvi Elimelech Shapira, depending on how you pronounce it. We're just going to say Shapira because that's how they say their name. And he moved to Munkatch from a city in Poland called Dinov. Am I saying it correctly? Because
Sounds good to me.
Because there is the Dinaver, there are the Dinaver Hasidim. So listen, I only know what they're called in Yiddish. So I'm again I'm hampered by my North American education and my and how most of these place names I know them by their Yiddish names, not by their Russian, Ukrainian, and what other Eastern European languages being used to describe the toponym. But anywho, so this is anyways, this is Tzvi Elimelech Shapira. He moved to Munkatch from Poland and he established a court there to become the very first Munkatch Rebbe. Eventually he left. He didn't remain in Munkatch, and he went to Poland again, and he established another Hasidic court, not in Munkatch, but in other locales. He sort of moved around quite a bit, and he had several sons. None of them actually went back to Munkatch. His son here that we're looking at right over here is the second of the Munkatcher Rebbes. And here, let me just let this person in. Here we go. The second in the line of the Rebbes associated with Munkatch is Eliezer Shapira, who's known by the name the Yodei Bina. The Yodei Bina was his work, which is a compendium of halachic decisions that was made. He also remained in Poland. He did not return to Munkatch. Elimelech's grandson, a man by the name of Shlomo that you see, let me get the cursor down over here, Shlomo Shapira, he actually does return to Munkatch and eventually establishes a court there, reestablishes the court there, and from him, all subsequent Munkatcher Rebbes are descended. He had a son, and this is Tzvi Hirsch Shapira, and he's known as the Darkei Teshuvah. Now, the Darkei Teshuvah was an incredible scholar. The Darkei Teshuvah is an incredibly important halachic work. It is a halachic, it almost reads like a Mishnah Brura on parts of Yoredeya. If you're familiar with Shulchan Aruch at all, these are the sections that deal with more ritualistic religious law, things about prohibited foods, appropriate relationships between husbands and wives. It's a part of the Shulchan Aruch that talks about the writing of a Sefer Torah. It's a different section of Shulchan Aruch, and it is a very, very important halachic work. Now, when Shlomo moved back to Munkatch, he did so in the last few decades of the 19th century. At the time, there were only a few thousand Jews residing there. And so we're going back again to this Rebbe over here, Shlomo Shapira, who's potentially sort of either the second, the third, or the first, depending on how you look at it, Rebbe of the Munkatcher Hasidim. At the time, again, there were only about 4,000 Jews living in the city of Munkatch, and Shlomo drew many people that he had sort of taken under his wing while he still lived in Poland, and he brought them with them from Galicia, and he was a Rebbe to a great number of people. He was a very rigid opponent to Haskalah or Jewish Enlightenment. He was a rigid opponent to reform, and he embraced a very highly combative and conservative brand of Judaism. And his court was very, very successful. It grew greatly. Going back to the very, very first of this group, who was Tzvi Elimelech Shapira, I know we're jumping around, the Bnei Yissaschar, who's the very, very first. He was a powerful opponent to Jews who had abandoned the traditional paths of Judaism. He called reformers the Eruv Rav, the mixed multitude, the people who came out with the Jews, who, according to Chazal, were the source of all the problems that the Jewish people experienced while in the desert. And he established from the very beginning, and it perpetuated all the way down until the more modern Rebbes, as we're going to see, again, this very combative and very conservative brand of very brash and outspoken Hasidic, very extreme right-wing Orthodox Judaism. Now, Shlomo's son, again, is the Darkei Teshuvah. He continued in the same path, also fighting virulently against just about everyone who he did not completely identify with. And he, in general, also added to the list of restrictions that his Hasidim had. So, for example, they were not allowed to learn Hungarian. His students were not allowed to speak the local language. He felt that this was a vehicle for assimilation. And because he himself could not speak Hungarian, which again was the reigning authority of Munkatch at the time, he was actually expelled as the city rabbi because he failed the language test. You needed to be able to speak the language in order to be the official land rabbiner for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And because he could not speak Hungarian or German for that matter, he was removed from his position. But because of the authority that he held as the Rebbe, as essentially the Av Beis Din, and he held so much political authority, even though he did not have an official position, he still himself maintained that sort of iron-fisted rule over the Jews of Munkatch. Now, Tzvi Hirsch, again, who's the Darkei Tshuva, who's on the bottom of this line, had only one son. And this is a larger-than-life character. This is Reb Chaim Elazar Shapira, who's also known as the Minchas Elazar, or as Mel's mother would say, the Minchas Eluzar, who also was very, very much within of the same mold as his father, his grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather before him. Lacking a formal secular education, he acquired a high school certificate from the town of Nitra in Slovakia so that he could fill the Austro-Hungarian authorities' requirement for a general education in order to serve as the rabbi. He was a man whose hegemony over the Jews of Munkatch would ultimately become absolute, especially after 1903, when he was appointed the chief of the rabbinical court as well as the land rabbiners. So he was the Av Beis Din and the Rav as well as the Rebbe. He became the Rebbe after his father passed away at age 46 in 1913. So he was 46 years old and he became the Rebbe, and this is him. This is the Minchas Elazar. Now, the Reb Chaim Elazar extended and deepened his father's tradition of rabbinical scholarship combined with extreme religious, social, and political conservatism. His early years of leadership were marked by World War I. Remember, he only ascended in 1913, which means that only a year later, World War I broke out. And World War I was a very traumatic experience for Eastern European Jewry and was viewed by many rabbinic leaders as Armageddon, the Milchama of Gog and Magog, that was the harbinger to the coming of Mashiach. And he shared this view as well. He viewed the coming of Mashiach as an imminent reality. And because of this, he also became much more confrontational and ideologically driven. He denounced and demonized any Jew whose behavior he felt fell outside of the bounds of the true way. And he even viewed the Zionists with an exceptional level of hatred. In 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, he actually viewed the Balfour Declaration as a tragedy of idol worship. Exile, he believed, was part of God's plan, and the only way that it could ever come to any kind of conclusion was with Mashiach's arrival. And he also felt that the Zionists were impeding Mashiach's coming by interfering in with the establishment of a Jewish state. He felt that the Zionists were actively preventing Mashiach from coming. So he had a particular vehemence against the Zionist movement. Part of his growing influence came from the belief that many Hasidim had that he had sort of an oracular ability. In about 1915, the Russians were coming. The Tsarist army was approaching Munkatch. While most of the rabbis and Jewish leaders of the time in the region said, run for your lives, you don't want to be under the thumb of the Tsar, he said, "Daiget nicht, don't worry, the Russians are not going to enter Munkatch." And he was right. The Russians did not enter Munkatch. And this gave him an extra level of clout. In his demographically developing community of burgeoning, growing Jewish Munkatch, he was viewed as something of a Navi, somebody who could tell the future, who had a way of sort of perceiving the world differently, and he came to eclipse all of his antecedents. The Rebbe was also known for virulently and uncompromisingly opposing even minute changes that he viewed to Jewish tradition. And he set the bar very, very high. He denounced Jews who emigrated to Israel, the United States, North America, for their failure to uphold traditional practices. And he even issued a very famous statement in 1933 that was recorded on film. And we're going to watch that now. It's actually really interesting. Okay, are you going to play it for me? Here we go. Let's watch this. You can read the translation on the bottom. Are you going to play the sound? We're going to actually see the full extent of that clip because it's actually a much shorter section of a larger film that we're actually going to watch, only 3 minutes of. But that's him at his daughter's wedding, decrying the failure of North American Jewry to keep Shabbos. Um, like other Hasidim, Munkatch was very concerned about the court's continuity. And they had very good reason because Reb Chaim Elazar and Chaya Chassia, who was his wife, had been married for 22 years, even before he became the Rebbe, and did not have any children. And his Hasidim were very, very anxious that he have an heir to perpetuate the line. Now, he himself wasn't particularly worried. He wasn't particularly concerned because Mashiach was coming anyways. You know, it was going to happen tomorrow. It made his need for a successor absolutely moot. But the Hasidim placed a great deal of pressure on him, and he ultimately conceded that he had a role to fill. And so after having been married, even before becoming the Rebbe, he was now 20 years, it was 1905, he had been married, he was pressured and he finally agreed to divorce his wife. Now, he divorced his wife, and according to accounts, according to records, this was a very emotional affair. They were both weeping, they're both crying at the divorce proceedings when she handed her a get. And even after they had separated, even after like for decades after she had passed away, he would still mark her yortzeit. He still had very fond feelings for her, but ultimately he did remarry, and he married somebody half his age. It was a woman by the name of Rachel Pearl, who was the daughter of the Komarno Rebbe, again, who was about 20 years old while he was in his 40s, and they were married for about 8 years with no children. Then finally, they did have a baby. The only problem was, and it's not a problem between you and me, but for them it was, that it was not a son, it was a daughter. And he was, again, without children, and he would now have no other children. So what did the Hasidim do? Her name was Frima, by the way, or Fruma. What do they do? Well, they said, okay, well, we have to find a great son-in-law who will then become the next Rebbe. But meanwhile, the Minchas Elazar doted on his daughter, and he even was prepared to make certain breaches to his own Hasidic protocol to I guess to accommodate his daughter. So, for example, if you're familiar with Hungarian Hasidim, men and women don't sit together under any circumstances ever. Perhaps husband and wives do. You never know because you're not there with them. If there's somebody else present, husband and wives do not even sit in the same room. So when the Rebbe would conduct a Pesach Seder, he would be in one room with all of his Hasidim, and his wife and daughter would be in a completely different room. But when it came time for the four questions, the Fir Kashos, Frima would actually enter the room and come in, stand before the Rebbe, and ask the four questions. And this was an incredible breach of protocol, especially for somebody who was so strident and so virulent in his positions. This was a very unusual thing for him to have done. And in fact, the Hasidim told him it's wrong. It's also she should not be allowed in. And he said, yeah, you're right. It probably shouldn't be done, but you're going to have a problem, my Hasidim, because if she's not here, I'm not here, and you need me. So tolerate it. So you see that they was prepared to adopt a certain amount of innovation, at least when it came to doting on his daughter. When All right, when she was 18 right. In 1926, they finally decided on a chassan. The match was formed with a man by the name of Rab Nosson David Rabinovich, who was the son of the Rebbe of Parchev. Parchev, which is a small town in eastern Poland. Am I saying? Are you familiar with it at all? Okay, he was a scion of the Biala Hasidim. So his mother also was also distantly related to the Munkatcher dynasty. The Chassan himself was also related to the Minchas Elazar's first wife. So this was a perfect match. So in 1926, 12-year-old Baruch Yehoshua Yerachmiel Rabinovich, we're going to call him Baruchel because that's what the Hasidim called him, who again, he was only 12 years old, and 11-year-old Frima were formerly betrothed. And 7 years later, in 1933, at about 20 years of age, the no, it was younger than that. But after 20 years of marriage, the Minchas Elazar, 20 years after the Minchas Elazar had been anointed as the Rebbe of Munkatch, they were wedded. And this was a wedding that was attended by thousands. And it became one of the most famous events in the 1930s, and it was also captured on film. So let's go. Let's see 3 minutes of a long 10-minute video. We're going to watch the Munkatcher Chasana. You can't really see because the quality is so poor, but they're all wearing these sashes that actually talk about the year in which this is all taking place, and it's all in Hebrew.
Is there any sound?
That's the Rebbe, that's the Chassan on a carriage. These are the throngs of people. You'll also see that there are men and women actually standing next to each other, even making physical contact. They're all being jostled around. And you see the local police force holding back the crowds. And you'll see eventually people start slipping through. They sneak underneath the arms of the police to get closer.
Sorry, Rebbe, what year is this roughly?
1933. You see the children break through. And this is the part that we already saw. It's hard to see here for those who are present, but the Rebbe is actually walking through the middle. There he is. This is him right over here, and with the white strimal.
Rabbi, wasn't there some sound to it?
Not really. You're just hearing a crowd. You're just hearing crowd noises. You're really not hearing anything. There's the Kala walking down to the chuppah. So that's Frima. That's the first bracha of the Sheva Brachos. So that's actually a Bubba Vernigan. Anywho, okay. So for getting back to let me go back to the family tree. Come on, you can do it. There we go. All right. So now for Baruchel, this is over here again. This is Baruchel over here. So he's the son-in-law of the Minchas Elazar, and he's the person on the right-hand column, the middle. So for his mother, whose name was Yutta, these events, her son getting married, was something of a mixed blessing. She spoke many languages and began inculcating her son with some of the court's values of the Biala Hasidim, which was a Polish Hasidus. They had a much broader worldview, and she was concerned that the Munkatchers were very parochial, were very, very provincial, and they had a very, very narrow outlook about just about everything. She also, like any, I'm going to use a word that doesn't come up all that often, a dowager Rebbitzin, whose son became a Rebbe, she naturally sought to become something to share in some of the power, which was the normal course of events. But because he was going to be living in a completely different area, he was going to be living in a different country, in fact, he was moving from Poland to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, she was not going to share in any of that power. And all of the authority, all of the anything that gets shared amongst the Rebbe's family would all go to the Shapira family. Ultimately, Baruchel's mother-in-law, as we're going to see, became a very, very dominant person in his life, where perhaps under other circumstances, had he remained back home and become the Rebbe of the local Hasidus, then his mother-in-law would have actually come to share in some of the authority and some of the power that comes with the Rebbe's household. But that didn't happen in this way. Accordingly, in 1936, when the Rebbe Chaim Elazar, the Minchas Elazar, the outgoing Rebbe, the father of the bride that we just saw, the one who was shying about people keeping Shabbos, when he died of melanoma, the succession of 23-year-old Baruch was something of an accepted and expected outcome. He was primed to become the next leader. He was adopted and taken into the court, and he was known to just about everyone. At the funeral, the Spinker Rebbe walked over to Baruchel and handed him a kvittel. A kvittel is a petition that you normally hand to somebody who is a Rebbe. This was rather ostentatious because he hadn't been proclaimed to be the Rebbe at the time, but he did so, and it was an indication that Baruchel was accepted from the moment that the Minchas Elazar passed away as the new Rebbe of the Munkatcher Hasidim. Another report recounts the enthusiasm that this young successor had when he spoke for the very first time as Rebbe, that the Rosh Yeshiva of the Munkatch Yeshiva jumped onto a table and recited the blessing that one makes when you see a Jewish scholar. So he was very, very well received and very well liked overall, at least initially. Baruchel not only viewed his position as Rebbe beyond question, he assumed also that he would have complete authority, the same kind of authority that his father had. However, that was somewhat naive. Perhaps he was led to believe this because there was no competition for this Hasidus, which is actually something we're going to see was actually a common outcome when a Rebbe passes away. He just didn't anticipate that he'd have to share a lot of authority and a lot of power with his mother-in-law. So the transition takes place in 1937, and it seems seamless. But the years that led up to that transition were actually quite eventful. Baruchel found it very long, even before his father passed away, to get along with his mother-in-law. And actually, for a time, he even separated from his wife and moved to Warsaw. His father-in-law, the Minchas Elazar, the previous Munkatcher Rebbe, recognized that just was not a tenable situation, and he sent his daughter to go live with her husband in Warsaw, and eventually the two of them went to Budapest, ostensibly for Baruchel to gather and find new followers for Munkatch, but probably also because as a Polish chassid with something of a different worldview, he wanted to remove himself from the provincialism of the court and go to a place where people lack the memory of his mother-in-law as the Rebbitzin and his father-in-law, the Chaim Elazar, this larger-than-life figure who always loomed large in the background. When he arrived in the cosmopolitan city of Budapest, Baruchel began to imagine himself as not just a Rebbe, but as something of a leader on the greater world stage. He said, this is something that his son articulated later on he said later on in an interview, that he wanted to be a Rav in Budapest rather than a Rebbe in Munkatch. Later in life, Baruchel would tell his sons many times that had the cost never happened, and after his father had passed away, he probably would have moved the court from Munkatch, again, this provincial small city, and bring it to the city of Budapest. He would have moved the yeshiva as well. And to be sure, this wasn't just something that he had dreamt of. This wasn't an unusual move to make. Many Rebbes were actually moving their courts from smaller remote villages to larger towns, even as the most religious of Jews started becoming urbanized. With such moves, they began to see themselves as moving on a larger stage than just simply being the Rebbe of a small little locality. They view themselves, as Baruch saw himself at this moment, as being something larger and something greater. Within a few months of his trip to Budapest, however, his father-in-law was diagnosed with cancer. After learning his prognosis, he convinced his son-in-law and his daughter to move back to Munkatch. Shortly thereafter, in 1934, Fruma and Baruch had their first child. Now, this was a great big deal for the court because this is the first male child born in decades in the sort of the Hasidic line of the Munkatch Rebbes. However, became the catalyst for something of a power struggle. From the very beginning of this child's life, trouble brewed around him. Arguments arose about what the boy's name was going to be. In the Minchas Elazar, again, who's the older Rebbe, the current Rebbe, whose son-in-law will become the Munkatch Rebbe, he wanted his son to be named Tzvi Hirsch after his father. However, Baruch wanted to name the child after his own father, Nasan David. The symbolism of the name would be very, very important because it would actually indicate under whose influence Baruch would operate. Would he operate as a Polish Rebbe or would he operate as a Hungarian Rebbe? So the dying Rebbe turned to his son-in-law and said, you're going to have a lot of children. You're going to be married for a long time, and you're going to have many opportunities to name your kids anything you want. As for me, I don't know if I'm ever going to live to see another child. I've been diagnosed with melanoma. Please name him after this. Everyone knew that this was going to be a big deal. And Baruch took a stand. He insisted that he had a halachic obligation to name him after his father, while the Reb Chaim Elazar, the Minchas Elazar, was no less adamant about his position that he needed a child named after his father, Tzvi Hirsch. Ultimately, they did something. Again, this is where the Minchas Elazar, he made a halachic decision that you can never do this, but in this instance here, he made an exception and allowed his child, this child over here, his grandson, Tzvi Hirsch Nasan David, to be named for two individuals, named for two people. This still did not entirely solve the problem because Baruch always referred to him as Duchu, which is the diminutive of David, and the Munkatcher Hasidim, his mother-in-law, and everyone else associated with his father-in-law's family, all refer to him as Herschela. So, and according to the family in an interview, they said, that Duchu never knew who he was because everybody called him different names. But that, despite this fact, his grandfather doted on him. In the early days of Baruch's leadership of the court, while his young wife became increasingly sick with tuberculosis, they would have three more children before 1940. And we have the three children that are named that are below. You have Chaim Elazar, who's ultimately named for his grandfather, his mother's father, the Minchas Elazar on the top. You have Moshe Leib, and you have Yitzchak Yaakov. Ultimately, they have a daughter whose name is Yuta, who was born much later on. In later years, Baruch reflected on those days, and he confided to some of his Hasidim that he had difficulties as an heir of an heir in Munkatch. He said, when my father-in-law took over the Rebistava, as it's called, from his father, he was 46 years old. When my turn came, Baruch said, I could speak well, I could write well, I could lead the tefillos well, but I had a major problem. I was only the son-in-law of the Minchas Elazar, who was a larger-than-life figure, that's me speaking, who could do all of those things as well, but had died at age 68 while still an active leader of his Hasidim. Who am I? I'm Baruch who took over the Hasidus at age 23. And he had the constant presence of his mother-in-law. As his wife became progressively more and more ill, his mother-in-law took on greater control over the runnings of the household as she knew more about the customs of Munkatch than her Polish son-in-law, and she also had the cachet of being the wife of the Minchas Elazar. Ultimately, a power struggle developed between the two, between his mother-in-law after his father-in-law passed away, and himself over control of the Hasidus. He revered his father-in-law, but his mother-in-law was rather domineering, and he depended on her because, again, his wife was too ill to really run the household and do all the things that a Hasidic Rebbitzin does. And she continued to call her grandson Herschela, which was a great insult to Baruch. But not only this, but she also would occasionally threaten him. She told him that it was written in the Minchas Elazar's Tzava, in his final will and testament, that my son-in-law, Baruch will take over the Chasidus only on the condition that he will follow the ways of Munkatch. She would always threaten him that if he did not follow the ways of the Munkatcher Hasidim, she would replace him. So Baruch felt very, very, did not feel secure in his position. He was insecure. And in all cases of dynastic succession, and sociologists have written about this, usually when you have somebody new who depends on the office for their authority as opposed to their own charisma, and was preceded by somebody who had a lot more experience, who had a lot more social cachet, who was a much who had a lot, just overall had a deeper relationship with the Hasidim. The newer Rebbe is always going to be challenged in his authority. And conservatism always remains because people always recall the father-in-law. It's only with time, as a new generation comes in and takes on positions of leadership, is the new Rebbe able to assert his own authority, and the charisma of the office is replaced with his own personal charisma as he becomes a much more important player within the lives and with a deeper relationship with the newer generation of Hasidim. So times of transition are always really, really fraught and always really, really difficult. And especially in a case like this, where Baruch was an outsider, a fremde, as they say in Yiddish, who was coming in and would always be suspect of being perhaps something of a non-traditionalist because of Polish Hasidim's more open-minded view of the world and all such things. So in a very, very conservative society where tradition is the cardinal rule, somebody like Baruch would have a very, very serious challenge. He perhaps could have surmounted this had not the Holocaust happened, because that really threw a monkey wrench into his ability to affect and to grow into his role as the Rebbe of the Munkatcher Hasidim. But that's not the only thing that was going on. When Baruch took over the court, he found that it was not the same court that it had been in the past. It was straddled with an incredible amount of debt. And not only that, but because of how strident and how oppositional the Minchas Elazar was, Reb Chaim Elazar was, his father-in-law after he passed away, he had many, many adversaries who were prepared and waiting to cut Munkatch down to side. And this would come back to haunt Baruch also, as we see that he would be sort of followed by the ghost of his father-in-law throughout much of the rest of his career. So, to rebuild his court, the new young Rebbe traveled again to Budapest, trying to attract not only new followers, but to also affect some kind of a movement, some kind of a change, and bring the court to Budapest and speak to more cosmopolitan Jewry. Hopefully also escape the shadow of his mother-in-law, escape the shadow of his father-in-law, and the influence of all the Hasidim who surrounded them. Again, this was all for naught because the Nazis began their conquest of Eastern Europe. The Second World War broke out in 1939, but by July of 1941, the Rebbe was deported because, again, he was Polish. And now, for whatever the case, for whatever reason, Hungary is now at war with Poland or something of the sort, but he was deported. He and Duchu his oldest son were deported. The other kids were hidden by his mother-in-law, but he was sent off on a train to Kamenetz. Now, at one of the stations, he and Duchu was able to get off the train. They were able to be separated from the rest. And he was able to hide in the town. He was hidden by local Jews. And he spent several months sort of traipsing around Poland until he finally reached Galicia once again. But he did hear that the train of deportees who were taken from Hungary to Poland, all the people he had been traveling with were all exterminated. They were told, they got off the train, they were told to dig their own grave. They did dig their own grave, and they were all summarily shot and covered over. So he and his son were fortuitously able to escape. Finally, he was able to send word to his mother-in-law, who was able to reach some wealthy Hungarian Jews, and they were able to intervene on his behalf. The intervention, of course, cost a huge sum of money, and he was allowed to enter Hungary, and he returned to Munkatch. However, he was afraid that he would be deported again, so he went back to Budapest and hid in an old age home until finally, several months later, he received papers saying that he was officially allowed to stay as long as he did not claim Hungarian citizenship. Now, this experience completely traumatized Duchu, who never recovered. He was mentally unbalanced for the rest of his life, and therefore, as a result, would not be chosen to become the next Rebbe. But this also convinced him that the Jews needed to escape Poland. He thought that Hungary was safe, and largely speaking, until the end of the war, Hungary was something of a safe haven for Jews. And he began to work in earnest in Budapest in the years 1942 and 1943 to help Polish Jews escape into Hungary. And he was able to help quite a number. His desperate efforts moved him to cooperate with all sorts of people in order to find financial support for these refugees, which included Reform Jews, Zionist Jews, and Hungarian nobles as well. Ultimately, his projects all foundered, and he was not able to save as many as he aimed. But as his own son said, this really affected him, and he was never able to climb out of the Holocaust. For 3 years, he desperately tried without success to enlarge his following in Budapest. And his efforts to save Jewish refugees, as well as his ability to speak to all kinds of Jews, from Hungarian aristocrats to non-Orthodox Jews, persuaded him that he could, as he wanted, play as an actor on a larger stage and organize Hungarian Jewry against the menace of Nazism. He felt that he had a call from heaven. However, he, again, was not particularly successful. As the situation for Jews worsened, even in Hungary, Baruchel concluded that only escape and emigration from Hungary could offer hope of survival. His despair grew incredibly when he came back to Munkatch to try and convince his Hasidim to escape, and they all basically told him to go fly a kite. He was not able to effect this kind of change in attitude from his Hasidim. By 1944, after working exceptionally hard to save as many Polish and Slovakian Jews as he could, and trying unsuccessfully to arouse the Jews of Hungary to the imminent danger, Baruchel concluded that he now had to make his own escape. And he decided that he was going to go to Israel. Now, if you recall, his father-in-law spoke vehemently against anyone who moved to Israel, who was virulently anti-Zionist. And this move would prove to be catastrophic for his rabbinic office, for his office as Rebbe, for his Rebistova. Even his mother-in-law, who managed to get the visas for him, refused to come. She knew that her daughter-in-law was exceptionally ill. She knew that her grandson was mentally unwell, but she insisted that she needed to be buried in Munkatch, and so she remained behind while Baruchel and his very, very young family escaped to Israel. He found himself in Palestine with 5 children. Because the daughter Yuta was born on the way to Israel. His wife was exceptionally unwell. Again, she had tuberculosis, and she had a final flare-up that sent her to be institutionalized the moment they arrived in Jerusalem. And he hoped that I can do what I did in Eastern Europe. I can become a Rebbe in Israel. But Jerusalem of 1944 was not Munkatch of 1937. He didn't have the throngs, he didn't have the crowds, he didn't have the office, he didn't have the same level of buy-in that he had while still living in Hungary. The Munkatch Hasidic community in Israel was tiny and had no time or interest in their Rebbe in Baruch Hu. So he received nothing from the Jews of Palestine, and he received nothing from the Jews of Eastern Europe. And he also received nothing from the Munkatcher Hasidim who had gone and established a community in New York. By the war's end, Baruch Hu's widowed mother was dead, as were his siblings, his in-laws, his uncles, and even of many of those who had worked and helped save him, they were either on the run or they had died. He was separated from his court and from the trappings of power. He lacked the presence of his mother-in-law, who maintained, as much as fraught as the relationship was, but maintained a connection between him and the Hasidim. He did not have the charisma, the personal charisma. He didn't have the savvy. He didn't have the money. He didn't have the institutions. He didn't have the local traditions that he depended on. And what he really found himself in a dire pickle. What do you do as a Rebbe without Hasidim living in 1944 Israel with five very small, very young children? He was an intellectual with a broad vision. He thought that he had a role to play, that he could play some grander, greater role, but it never amounted to anything. He wanted to be a public figure, and at one point he even stood on stage with David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir in order to voice his protest against the British white papers that limited Jewish immigration to Palestine. To the anti-Zionist Munkatcher Hasidim, the sight of him standing side by side with these individuals was just such an incredible anathema. This alienated him and isolated him further from his Hasidim. So, feeling quite overwhelmed, what does he do? He launched his candidacy in 1946 for the position of chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. Through his office, he thought that perhaps he could restore his rabbinic authority in Tel Aviv, replacing Munkatch with Tel Aviv. It'd be a different stage, a different age, but he could redo and reestablish and recreate what he had in Eastern Europe. But his candidacy failed before it even became formalized. Remember what I said before about how his father-in-law had antagonized a lot of people? Well, the Belzer Hasidim, who were a large contingent of the city, had a score to settle with Munkatch, and they characterized him as the embodiment of his father-in-law. Now, the other large group, the largest group of Hasidim in Israel at the time, were the Gerer Hasidim. So they could have offset the Belzers, but they also had it out for the Munkatcher because of his father-in-law, because the Munkatcher had decried the previous Ger Rebbe as a heretic for cohorting and for accommodating Zionism and be willing to live in Israel under Zionist auspices. The Ger Hasidim wanted nothing to do. They viewed or they characterized again Baruch Hu as his father-in-law, as an extension of his father-in-law, and they would have no tolerance of the Minchas Elazar's heir taking an office, taking a role in what they considered to be their territory. Not only this, but the religious Zionists also recalled the Minchas Elazar's strident anti-Zionist position, and they viewed him also as something as an anathema, and he was forced to withdraw his candidacy before it even was officially recognized. So without a position, without a court, he now was simply a widowed immigrant with five young children, and he was not particularly adept at parenting. His relationship with his children was quite fraught. His children recall in interviews that they don't remember a single time during this period that he ever hugged them or kissed them, but they do recall on many occasions chapen apach, getting a beating. So he was at a wit's end. So Baruch Hu decided to look for a nanny, and his sister helped him find one, a woman by the name of Yehudit Wallhaus. And you can see already by her name, Yehudit, that she was not of the same ilk as the Munkatcher Hasidim. She was actually a German Jewish immigrant. She was 19 years old and she had no experience caring for children, especially one who was mentally unwell, like their oldest son, Duchu, and she was completely overwhelmed. But they had no choice. They had nobody else. She was their nanny. But then Baruch was encountered another problem. I can't live as an unmarried man in a house with an unmarried woman. That is also problematic according to halacha. So he decided to marry her. So he did. They got married. Yehudit became his new wife. The marriage, however, would not begin with a great public wedding like we saw in the film in Munkatch. Vows were exchanged rather quickly in a court with a Rav in Ranana, north of Tel Aviv. Baruch Hu wore a shtreimel, but it was not a Hasidic wedding. No one from Munkatch was formally invited, and there were very few guests, and those guests who were there were from Yehudit's parents' family, who lived on a little kibbutz just outside. Even Baruch Hu's own children did not attend the wedding. The children bore feelings of abandonment by their father at this time. And this only grew when the couple had children of their own. Yehudit's parents again lived in this little agricultural settlement, this little kibbutz just outside of Ranana, and they became grandparents to these children. These were the most stable and loving relationships that these kids had. And as Baruch Hu and Yehudit actually did travel to North America in an attempt to reestablish his court, the five children remained with Yehudit's parents, and they described this as being the only pleasant time in their childhood that they would recall, they would remember. Having failed to become the rabbi of Tel Aviv and still looking to reconstruct his life, Baruch Hu tried to reestablish his rabbinic court in the United States, leaving his four children behind, rather, who came with them. He deposited his son in Yeshiva's Torah V'das, and there he remained, essentially abandoned. And he was not mentally well, and he remained mentally unstable as a ward of the Jewish community for the rest of his life. He attempted to reestablish with the surviving Munkatch Hasidim who lived in New York, but he was not successful. So Baruch Hu returned to Israel, and he had nothing. So he decided to make a drastic change. So in 1951, he and his family moved to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he became the chief rabbi of the city. There were still people who remembered who he was, and he would still receive visitors. And even in 1952, there was another attempt by the Munkatcher Hasidim to try and draw him to the north, to try to draw him to New York to become the Rebbe. But again, it amounted to nothing. Again, there were many events had transpired. He felt alienated and abandoned by the Hasidim. He harbored something of a grudge against them. At the same time, they viewed him with a great deal of suspicion because of his pro-Zionist activities. Despite the fact that he was acting to save his life and to save the lives of other people, they viewed his actions as completely beyond the pale of what the son-in-law of the Minchas Elazar should have ever done. So Baruch Hu, feeling estranged, and the Hasidim feeling that he wasn't just right for the job, never found a meeting of the minds. And he really never returned to become the Rebbe of Munkatch, despite the fact that his letterhead always said, Da Munkatch. You can see also from his trajectory, he became something of a modern rabbi. He attended university. He had earned a degree in philosophy. He began teaching in the university. When he tried to find sources or books or literature to inspire Brazilian Jewry, he didn't reach out to the Hasidic community. Not that there would be all that much for him anyways, but he reached out to the modern Orthodox congregations and asked for material that could be translated into Portuguese. He fell completely out of his relationship with the Hasidim. Some Hasidim would occasionally come and visit him because he was still the Rebbe, but when they would encounter often the Encyclopedia Britannica on his bookshelf, they were just so horrified, that they accused him of heresy and would often just walk out. He also had different hopes for his children. He sent his children to Brazilian schools, public school, where there were crucifixes on the wall. In the afternoon, they studied with a Malamed, but he hoped that they would achieve university degrees. He was not necessarily hoping that they would go into the rabbinate or even become Rebbes or vice versa. So what happens to the sons? What happens, again, to these three here? So we know that Duchu's in Torah V'das, who's not mentally well. What happens to Chaim Elazar, Moshe Leib, and Yitzchak Yaakov? Well, there always has to be a Telz connection, because the Telzer Rosh Hashiva was fundraising in Brazil. He goes to Baruch Hu, asks for a letter of recommendation so that he could approach wealthy Brazilian Jews, and encounters the children. And he was shocked. He was shocked. This is Rabbi Elazar Surutskin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, one of the Rosh Yeshiva of Telz, Cleveland. And he encounters these three boys, and he's astounded that the grandson of the Minchas Elazar and the great grandchildren of the Darkei Tshuva now were practically Jewishly illiterate. He correctly guessed that Baruch Hu was not going to send them to Torah V'das. Duchu was miserable there. He wasn't going to send them to the Hungarian yeshivas of the only one being of Satmar, because Satmar was absorbing the Munkatch Hasidim in New York. And also he had grand designs that his children would go off to university. So he convinced Baruch Hu to send his sons to Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland. It was a yeshiva that also had in its name, on its letterhead, Rabbinical College. They would go there. It had a dormitory. It had a campus, unlike Torah V'das, and it also offered a high school diploma. Baruch Hu was convinced and did, in fact, send the oldest two, Chaim Elazar and Moshe Leib, to Telz, Cleveland, and Yitzchak Yaakov joined them a year later. So these two boys, Chaim Elazar and Moshe Leib, they meet with the Telzer Rosh Yeshiva, Reb Mordechai Katz. And Reb Mordechai Katz takes these boys aside, and I'm going to read from an interview what he told them. He said, "We come from a small town in Lithuania. We come from a kleine Stadt, Telsha. I'm even ashamed to say how small it is. Insignificant place. When I travel now throughout the United States on behalf of the yeshiva, I hear of all sorts of Hasidic dynasties and Rebbes that I never heard about before the war, even while I was living in my little town of Telz in Lithuania. But I tell you, though, when it comes to Munkatch, we in Telz heard of the Munkatcher Rebbe. What do you think we heard about the Munkatcher Hasidim? Do you think it was the nigunim that they sang, or how they distributed shirayim, the leftover foods? No, he said. What we knew about the Munkatcher Hasidim was that they knew how to learn Torah. We know about the Darkei Tshuva, their great-grandfather. We know about the Minchas Elazar. These were halachic authorities that even we in Lithuania wouldn't dare contradict. And here, you are their grandchildren. The Munkatcher Hasidim might approach you and might ask you to become their Rebbe. If you don't know the tunes of the Munkatcher Hasidim, and if you don't know how to distribute shirayim, they can overlook that. But if you can't learn Torah like the Minchas Elazar or like the Darkei Tshuva, you can never be their Rebbe. And so the boys threw themselves into their studies. And Reb Motel Katz was not incorrect. It was at this point, within a year or two later, that the Munkatcher Hasidim looked towards the future. They carried on without a Rebbe, but it really didn't work. So their most prominent member at the time was a Gabbai, Reb Chaim Dov Ber Greenfield, known as Chaim Ber, who had been the Gabbai to the Minchas Elazar, as well as to the Hoizbacher, which is essentially the assistant to the Darkei Tshuva. And he and a coterie of Munkatcher Hasidim went to Cleveland to ask Chaim Elazar to consider becoming their new Rebbe. Now, Chaim Elazar in an interview actually said they wanted another Chaim Elazar as the Rebbe. He was named after his grandfather. They wanted another Chaim Elazar. Names are really important to Hasidim. But he didn't want to. He refused immediately. He remembered those incidents about the Encyclopedia Britannica. He knew that the Rebistava ruined his father's life, and he did not want anything to do with this. And this is a quote from an interview. "I valued my privacy, and when I saw how a Rebbe's life was not his own, I knew I did not want that life." So Chaim Elazar returned to Israel after he was done his studies in Telz Yeshiva and enrolled in Merkaz Harav, to probably the chagrin of his grandfather in Shemaim, who rolled over in his grave, the yeshiva of Rav Kook, a Zionist institution, oiveh. So now Chaim Elazar does not want to be the Rebbe. So they turn to Moshe Leib. So a year or two later, they go down, they go to Moshe Leib. And Moshe Leib says, I can't say no. He felt that a great injustice was done to the Munkatcher Hasidim in the abdication of his father. And he, despite the fact that he did feel very comfortable in the non-Hasidic Welt, he understood that if he said no, his brother also would say no, and as a result, Munkatch would come to an end. And thus, he said, it would end it would end the heritage, it would end the legacy of his grandfather, the Minchas Elazar, and his great grandfather, and all the way back. So, after a series of conversations, he agreed. So he spent the following Pesach in New York with the Munkatcher Hasidim, and he began being primed and prepped to be their new Rebbe. In fact, he stopped shaving at this point. He was shaving until now. Was required. It still is in Tel Yeshiva. You must shave. You may not grow a beard as a bacher. He started growing a beard at this time. However, one step remained. He needed to ask his father for permission. Moshe Leib knew that if he acted like his successor, he would effectively end any claims that his father had to the Rebbe, and that perhaps would be traumatic. His father was no longer ready to be the Rebbe, but he had very deep misgivings about his son. He said that the Hasidim wouldn't support you. You will suffer disappointments just like I did. He wouldn't be given financial or social support. He warned him that Hasidim in America are not like the Hasidim in Europe. They really don't know what a Rebbe is supposed to be. I grew up as the son of a Rebbe and then was primed for the position by my father-in-law. Who's going to teach you how to be a Rebbe? Is it going to be the Gabbai? A Gabbai doesn't know the inner world of what it means to be a Rebbe. He says nowadays, being a Rebbe of Hasidim is technical, it's soulless. A Rebbe in America needs to know PR. He said this entire conversation was in Yiddish, but he said the last thing in English. He said, a Rebbe in America needs to know PR. Now knowing that his father was completely disinterested in the position for himself, he sent word back to Chaim Ber, again, the Gabbai of Munkatch, that he was prepared now to become the Rebbe. His father didn't want the position. So he needed to get married. That was the first step for him that would culminate in the process to becoming the Munkatch Rebbe. So the 22-year-old Moshe Leib was wed to Nechama Perel Bernstein of Yerushalayim. She came from a family that traced its roots back to the Baal Shem Tov, the originator, the founder of Hasidus. She was also a distant relative, and her father was the Dayan of the Agudas Yisrael rabbinical court. They would get married in New York, where he would set up his new court. This would be done in the presence of his Hasidim, but ironically, his older brother Chaim Elazar, who had rejected the Rebbe, was also going to be getting married the next week in Yerushalayim, and therefore his older brother missed the wedding. Now, under normal circumstances, a Hasidic wedding is a very, very big deal. If you saw the film, it sort of heralds the future. It has a lot of significance. There's a lot of pomp and ceremony to it. But this was going to be different. This was going to be a completely unusual wedding, because normally, while a wedding of the inheritor of the Rebbe's oldest son, is usually a statement about continuation, here the wedding was actually going to be about discontinuation. Any claim that Baruch had to being the Rebbe would effectively end with the marriage. And this was going to prove to be a very emotional experience for his father. So again, Baruch, who's the erstwhile Rebbe, is now going to have to confront losing the crown and having his son taken away by the people he blamed for his own failure and for the tragedies in his life. Baruch was asked at one point. So when he came, he says, hey, let's have the wedding on Saturday night. That way the Satmar Rebbe could officiate and he'll still be wearing his Shabbos clothes. He seemed rather ambivalent. What did he say? He says, I don't care. Just make sure I can make it home in time make it in time to Israel for Chaim Elazar's wedding, which will take place the following week. He had a lot of indifference. He had a lot of ambivalence. And he also knew that normally the father pays for the wedding. In this case here, the father was not paying for the wedding. It was the Gabbai Chaim Ber, a person that he actually loathed. Again, as somebody who did not understand or knew what it meant to be a Rebbe. He was only the Gabbai. So the ceremony began at midnight with the Satmar Rebbe arrived late, as was his wont. Baruchel's diminution began in earnest at this point. According to family custom, if the mother of the chassan is not alive, then the father does not walk the chassan to the chuppah. So Baruchel's half brother walked Moshe Leib to the chuppah. Next, Baruch was given none of the brachos of the Sheva brachos that are said under the chuppah. The only kavod that he received was reading the ksuba. Chaim Ber received more honor at the chuppah, where he was asked to recite the seven blessings, or some of the seven blessings. The dancing began, and Reb Baruch, as he was known, began dancing with his son Moshe Leib, the Naya Rebbe. This was a first dance, and this actually comes with a lot of ritual to it. The father, the Rebbe, will dance with his son, and he will dance for a period of time. Nobody else dances for as long as those two together. So other Rebbes were present. The Satmar Rebbe was there. They all danced with Moshe Leib, the Chassan, the new Munkatch Rebbe, but they all danced for a period of time that was shorter than the time that Baruch will dance with him. But then there was one exception, and that was Chaim Ber, the Gabbai. Chaim Ber began dancing with Moshe Leib. And this is from a quote from people who are present. Chaim Ber forgot that he was a Gabbai and not a Rebbe. He didn't dance with the self-effacement of a Gabbai, but with an ostentatious display of enthusiasm that might be expected of a host. He twirled along with Moshe Leib while Baruch stood on the margins. And then, not only did he dance with exuberance, he danced for a longer period of time than Baruch. So this was an act of self-aggrandizement, and this was a breach of protocol. And it was viewed as such by Baruch, the father of the new Rebbe himself, Moshe Leib, and just about everyone else who was present. Baruch couldn't hold it back any longer and physically jumped and attacked Chaim Ber. Pulled at his beard, punched, kicked. He unplugged the music, and he grabbed the microphone from the band, and he started a tirade, letting out all his feelings. He saw this entire escapade as a slight and an embarrassment. He talked about why he had left Munkatch and why he didn't settle in North America. He justified his disappointments to the Hasidim. He couldn't give his approval to the transition that was taking place. And perhaps, and this is just me speaking, in the tug of war that played itself out in front of everyone, he seemed to express a desire to celebrate with his son, while at the same time he mourned what this represented. And he was unready and unwilling to be parted from both his son and the rabbinic office, especially in such a humiliating way. Baruch made a scene. The crowd was not particularly sympathetic to him. They started booing him. He walked out, left. And the son and father really never reconciled. Baruch died in the 1990s, and this is taking place in the 1950s. 40 years, they never really had another conversation with each other. The first Shabbos after Moshe Leib's wedding, Chaim Ber stood up in the Munkatcher Shtibel and said, "Mazel tov, we have a new Rebbe. We have a new Rebbe." Moshe Leib tried pushing off the day that he actually ascended but he couldn't push it off forever. The Hasidim eventually demanded that he become fully engaged. People started asking him for blessings, advice, and for counsel. Moshe Leib tried to remain the same person that he was, but it was always a battle. He records in interviews. He uncurled his payas that were previously behind his ears and held them in front, and he took on the office with renewed vigor that very year on the yard site of the Minchas Elazar and began accepting petitions from his Hasidim. He had a lot of on-the-job training to do, and Chaim Ber would always be by his side and give him direction. Chaim Ber would also, would also, give him indications as to what he should be doing and what he should be saying. So, for example, when somebody hadn't been to visit the Rebbe for a while, Chaim Ber would upbraid him and say, "The Rebbe hasn't seen you for too long a time." If he did something that was wrong, Chaim Ber was sure to tell him. He assured him that he had done the same with his father and with his grandfather and even his great-grandfather. One time they told Moshe Leib, people are upset at him. You walk around in black socks. A Rebbe should wear white stockings. We are your Hasidim, he said. We want our Rebbe to wear white stockings, as did the Minchas Elazar, and as do all the Rebbes these days. And from then on, he had to wear white stockings. He learned the limits of privacy and leadership and what exactly it was that the Hasidim could demand of him. In 1969, he removed his court from Williamsburg to Borough Park, and he tried to bolster the educational arm, and he became something of a fixer within the Jewish community. One of the New York newspapers described him as the ultra-Orthodox community's most influential rabbi in government affairs in New York. He works behind the scenes for some of the most prominent Hasidic Jews and their supporters who ran afoul of the law. He pleads their defenses and mitigates their punishments. He is understanding and fair, and perhaps most importantly, discreet and frequently successful in his efforts. He doesn't like giving brachos. When he's asked about how he feels about giving blessings, he says, well, any Jew can give a bracha. What did we read about recently in Parshas Lech Lecha? Hayei bracha, Hashem says, you Avram, you're going to be a bracha. You're going to give brachos. Any Jew with a full heart can give a bracha, and that's what I do. I give bracha with a full heart. And generally speaking, he said, I have good results. There's a whole new generation of Hasidim in Brooklyn. Most people who are alive now have no memory of the Minchas Elazar and the pre-war Eastern European Jewry. And Moshe Leib is not always people's first choice to be the new Rebbe. And actually, you know what? I'm just remembering here, I actually have some pictures here. That's the Minchas Elazar. No, I don't want to show the video again. Come on, you can do it. Here we go. Here's the Minchas Elazar here. Sorry, this is Moshe Leib, excuse me. This is Moshe Leib. This is the current Munkatch Rebbe. He's now about 84 years old. He cleaves, at least he says in his interview, to what his grandfather had written, what the Minchas Elazar wrote. He said, do not agitate, don't propagandize, don't send out emissaries or gather large audiences for one's words. Don't poach Hasidim and remain religiously repulsed by the honor of being a rabbi. He does have a following. He's viewed in a very favorable way. There's a lot of discord in the Hasidische Welt, especially as far as succession goes. And Munkatch, by and large, has managed to avoid that. He's involved all of his children in the court. They all play a role, his children, his grandchildren. They're not worried about succession. They don't know who the next Rebbe is going to be, but nobody is particularly concerned or worried about it. But the family is devoted, the family is committed to ensuring that there be no discord amongst them, and there's no hurry to move towards transition. But it's a fascinating story about the interpersonal relationships that go on behind the scenes, as well as the inner turmoil and clash that comes when one Rebbe, albeit reluctantly, abdicates his position, only to have his child reject his way of life and come back and take the crown for himself. And I'm now open to questions, comments, or rebuttals as I stop the recording.